"Will you marry me, Miss Aurora?" the little boy blurted out, then hurriedly corrected himself with a seriousness so earnest it was almost adorable. "No, I mean, would you agree to marry me, ma'am?" Aurora Bennett was curled behind a battered old shelf in the dim storage room of the Italian restaurant Bella Notte in Brooklyn, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it might break free of her ribs. Outside the thin door, her stepmother Regina's voice sliced through the air like a blade. "You can hide wherever you want, Aurora. It's useless. Tony Marchetti is waiting. You think I'll let you ruin my $50,000 deal?" Aurora pressed her back against the ice-cold metal shelving, pulled her knees to her chest, and tried not to breathe. $50,000. That was the gambling debt her stepmother owed. And to pay it off, she'd promised to sell Aurora into a human trafficking ring. Today was the deadline. 48 hours were up. They'd come to take her. Brittany, her stepsister, chimed in with a sharp little laugh. "Go on. Keep hiding. The more you run, the more Tony likes it." He said girls who fight back sell for a higher price. Aurora bit down so hard her lips split, the taste of blood mixing with the tears threatening to spill. How many times had she run? How many jobs had she changed? How many places had she packed up and fled? And still they always found her. Always. Then a small rustle sounded right behind her. Aurora's heart stopped. She spun, one hand grabbing the nearest frying pan as a weapon, only to see a boy about 6 or 7 step out from the corner of the storage room, big round eyes blinking at her in the dark. "Are you hiding too?" he whispered, his voice full of quiet sympathy. Aurora let out the breath she'd been holding and lowered the pan. "Who are you? Why are you in here?" "I'm Zane," the boy said, puffing out his chest with the pride of a tiny general announcing himself. "I'm hiding from my dad. He wants to take me to see a doctor. I hate doctors." In spite of everything, Aurora felt a smile tug at her mouth, even as she stood on the edge of disaster. "Then you and I are the same," she whispered. "I'm hiding from bad people too." Zane tilted his head, his dark eyes brightening. "Bad people, like the witch in fairy tales. Are you a princess being chased by a witch?" "Something like that," Aurora murmured. He went quiet for a moment, his face set with the solemn focus of a child solving the most important question in the world. Then he stepped closer, lifted his chin, and looked at her with a fierce kind of certainty that didn't match his age. "Then you need a knight," Zane declared. "In my stories, when a princess gets caught by a witch, a knight always comes to save her. Or a prince. Or a rich person. Rich people have lots of soldiers. Witches are scared of them." Aurora let out a soft, helpless laugh, even with fear tightening around her throat. "So where do I find a rich knight right now?" Zane blinked, as if the answer were so obvious it barely deserved the question. "Me. Who else?" He planted his fists at his hips and struck a pose like a cartoon superhero. "Marry me, Miss Aurora." "No, I mean, would you agree to marry me, ma'am? My dad has a lot of money. Like, a whole lot. And guns, too. Lots of guns. All the bad people are scared of my dad." Aurora couldn't help it. A quiet laugh slipped out before she could stop it. She knelt to his height and gently smoothed his glossy black hair. "If I marry you," she teased in a whisper, "are you sure you can protect me from the witch?" 100%. Zane nodded so hard his hair flopped over his forehead. "My dad's the strongest person in the world. Everyone's scared of him. If you marry me, you'll be safe right away." Aurora looked at him, and something inside her softened, almost breaking, at the child's innocence and stubborn sincerity. How long had it been since anyone wanted to protect her? How long since she'd been treated like a person instead of merchandise? "Then I agree," she said gently. "I'll marry you." Zane's eyes lit up as if he'd just caught a falling star. "Really? Really? You have to promise. Pinky promise." Aurora smiled and hooked her little finger around his tiny one. "I promise." "Yay!" Zane almost shouted, then clapped a hand over his own mouth. Leaning in, he whispered with bubbling excitement, "You're going to be my wife. I'm going to protect you forever." Aurora smiled, thinking it was only a child's sweet game, one warm moment in the middle of her life's nightmare, never imagining that this careless promise would turn her fate on its head, because right then, the storage room door slammed open with a violent bang. Aurora jolted and, by instinct, pulled Zane behind her, her heart stuttering in her chest. But it wasn't Regina. It wasn't Brittany. It wasn't Tony Marchetti. A man stepped inside, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a black suit tailored to every hard line of his body. His dark hair was swept back, his jaw cut square and unyielding, and his gray eyes were cold as steel as they swept the cramped room with a kind of danger that felt lethal. 2 large bodyguards followed, hands resting at their waists where something was clearly hidden beneath their suit jackets. Aurora went rigid. She knew that face. All of New York knew that face. Kian Moretti, the boss of the most notorious Mafia family on the east coast of the United States. His gaze stopped on Aurora, traveled from head to toe, then paused on the bruises around her wrist. Something flickered in those gray eyes, but it vanished too fast for her to name it. "Zane," he said, his voice low and cold. "What did I tell you about running off?" But Zane wasn't afraid. The boy darted out from behind Aurora, grabbed her hand, and tugged her toward the most terrifying man in New York, with a grin wide enough to split his face. "Dad, this is Aurora, my fiancée. She's being chased by a witch, so I proposed to her so I could protect her. You have to help me chase the witch away, okay?" Kian Moretti fell silent. Aurora fell silent. The whole room fell silent. Then those steel-gray eyes shifted slowly from his son to the trembling woman in front of him, and Aurora could have sworn she saw the faintest curve touch the corner of his mouth. "My son's fiancée," Kian Moretti repeated, his deep voice rolling like distant thunder. "Interesting." And Aurora Bennett knew that from this moment on, her life would never be the same again. If you want to know how Aurora will survive in this dangerous mafia world, please hit like to support the channel. Don't forget to share this story with the friends you love drama with, and subscribe with notifications so you won't miss the next episodes. Kian Moretti stood there for one more beat, his piercing silver gaze passing over Aurora, as if he could read every page of her life in a single instant. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the storage room, the 2 bodyguards falling in behind him like shadows. Zane kept a tight hold on Aurora's hand and tugged her along. "Come on, you have to meet your witch," the boy said, eager as if he were about to watch a superhero showdown. Aurora wanted to resist, wanted to say she didn't need anyone's help, but her feet kept moving as though some invisible force were pulling her forward. They stepped into the main dining area, where Regina and Brittany were screaming at the elderly manager. "I know she's here. Bring her out right now," Regina roared, her face flushed with rage, the wrinkles on her forehead drawn tight as if she might explode. Brittany stood beside her with her arms folded, a poisonous smile spreading when she saw Aurora appear. "Well, look who it is, my dear big sister," Brittany hissed. "Thought you could hide? Tony's waiting outside. He said if you behave, he'll be gentler with you." Aurora felt her knees threaten to buckle. Tony Marchetti. The name hit her like a bucket of ice straight to the heart. She'd heard enough stories about him, about girls who vanished without a trace, about shipping containers carrying human beings onto cargo ships bound for international waters in the dead of night. But before she could react, Kian Moretti stepped forward and placed himself between her and the 2 cruel women. He didn't say anything. He simply stood there, and the air in the restaurant seemed to thicken, turning heavy and close. Regina lifted her chin, ready to scream at the man who dared block her. But the moment her eyes met Kian's face, every word died in her throat. She recognized him. All of New York recognized that face. It showed up on the front page whenever a business empire collapsed, whenever a mafia family was wiped out, whenever someone was foolish enough to touch the territory of the Moretti family. "She belongs to me." Kian spoke at last, his voice low and cold as steel. Not loud at all, yet every word echoed in the suffocating silence. "Get out." Just 4 words, no explanation, no specific threat. And yet Regina understood. She'd lived long enough around the underworld to know there were people even Tony Marchetti wouldn't dare touch, and Kian Moretti sat at the top of that list. Regina's face went paper white. She stumbled back 1 step, then another, her hand clamping around Brittany's arm. "Let's go," she whispered, her voice shaking. Brittany looked as if she wanted to argue, but when she saw Kian's bodyguards resting their hands on their belts, where something clearly bulged beneath the suit fabric, she fell silent too. They ran. Like 2 rats spotting a cat, they bolted for the door and disappeared into the crowd on the streets of Brooklyn. Aurora stood frozen, unable to believe what had just happened. In all 27 years of her life, she had never seen Regina afraid like that. Not once. "Are you all right?" Kian's voice came again, still cool, but with something else underneath, perhaps the faintest concern. Carefully hidden, Aurora nodded. not trusting her voice if she opened her mouth. Kian slipped a hand into his suit jacket and drew out a black business card. No name, no title, only a string of phone numbers printed in silver ink. He held it out to her. "If they come back," he said, "call this number." Aurora looked down at the card, then up at him. Her pride surged, the same pride that had kept her alive through years of hell. "I don't need anyone to save me," she said, her voice harder than she meant it to be. "I can handle myself." Kian watched her for a long moment, his gray eyes giving away nothing. Then he gave a slight nod. "Take it," he said, "in case you change your mind." He turned away, and Zane waved at Aurora, his grin swallowing up his small face. "Goodbye, my future wife. Don't forget your promise. I'm going to protect you forever." Aurora didn't know how long she stood there, watching the black Maybach glide smoothly into traffic and vanish. The card was still in her hand, her fingers unconsciously tracing the silver numbers. She wanted to throw it away. She should have thrown it away, but in the end, she slipped it into the pocket of her faded jeans. That night, Aurora went back to her crumbling apartment in the Bronx. The room was no bigger than a closet in the mansions of the wealthy, with walls stained by damp and mold, and a window that wouldn't seal shut. She locked the door, wedged a chair beneath the handle the way she did every night, and sat down on the squeaking bed. Her hands were still shaking. The image of Kian Moretti's cold eyes kept flashing in her mind, tangled with Zane's innocent smile, with Regina's screaming, with the shadow of Tony Marchetti she knew was lurking somewhere out there. Her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number, but she knew exactly who it was. 48 hours are up. Tony's coming to take you. This time nobody's going to save you, you worthless girl. Regina. Aurora felt sick. She threw the phone onto the bed and curled into the corner with her knees hugged tight, like a terrified child. 48 hours. She had 48 hours before her life ended. Literally, she could run. She had run so many times already. Changed jobs, changed homes, changed cities, but they always found her. Always. Her eyes dropped to the black card on the nightstand, the silver numbers glinting under the streetlight leaking through the window. "If they come back, call this number." Kian Moretti's voice echoed in her head. No, she couldn't call. She didn't owe anyone. She didn't need anyone. She could handle herself. She repeated it over and over in her mind like a spell. While outside the window, New York's darkness swallowed everything, and somewhere in a city of millions, people she couldn't see were counting down the seconds until they came for her. Aurora couldn't sleep that night. She lay curled on the squeaking bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling stained with damp blotches, her ears stretched tight to catch the smallest sound from the hallway outside. Every set of footsteps, every door slammed in a neighbor's apartment, made her heart leap violently. The black business card still sat on the nightstand, the silver numbers seeming to mock her stubbornness. She'd reached for it at least 5 times, then put it down again. She didn't need anyone to save her. She could take care of herself. She'd felt emotionally alone for 27 years, hadn't she? But when the clock struck 2 in the morning, everything changed. A brutal pounding exploded against the door like thunder, so hard the entire room shuddered. "Open up, you bitch! We know you're in there!" A man's voice, rough and thick with menace. Aurora shot upright, her heart hammering like it wanted to tear out of her chest. Not Regina. These were Tony Marchetti's men. They'd come. 48 hours weren't even up, but they'd come anyway. There wasn't time to think. Survival instinct, honed by years of being hunted, snapped to life. She lunged for the window, trembling hands shoving the old glass up. Behind her came the crash of a boot to the door, then the sickening sound of wood splitting. She didn't look back. She hauled herself through the window, feet finding the cold, rusted fire escape. The stairs rattled under every step, metal clanging against metal, harsh in the stillness of the night. She heard shouting from the apartment, the thud of pursuit, the scrape of a heavy body climbing out the window. "You piece of shit! Stop!" Aurora didn't stop. She ran like she'd never run before, bare feet slapping the freezing metal steps, her breath coming so fast it burned. She jumped the last few steps, sprawled in the dark alley, her knees scraping on cold concrete, but she forced herself up at once and kept running. The alley was ink black, lit only by a few streetlights that spilled weak puddles of light. The stench of rotting garbage, urine, desperation. Aurora sprinted past trash cans and piles of cardboard, slipped, fell, got up again. Behind her, The pounding footsteps drew closer, closer. Then a hand seized her hair and yanked so hard she felt her scalp might tear. Aurora screamed, the sound echoing down the empty alley. But this was the Bronx at 2 a.m, and no one cared about a girl's scream. "Thought you could run, you bitch?" The man jerked her around, and Aurora saw a face carved with scars, eyes dead and blank like a fish's. A second man was coming from behind, holding something that flashed under the streetlight. A knife, or a gun. Aurora wasn't sure, and she didn't want to know. "Tony says you're special merchandise," the scarred man sneered, his breath reeking of cigarettes and liquor as it washed over her. "He's gonna be real happy when he sees you." Aurora fought like a wild thing, her nails raking his face, her knee driving into his stomach. He roared in pain, then struck her with a backhanded blow like a sledgehammer. Her ear rang, her mouth filled with the copper taste of blood. "You bitch, you dare." But he never finished. A black SUV tore into the alley at a terrifying speed, headlights blazing, glaring like light from hell. The vehicle screeched to a stop. A door flew open, and 2 dark figures sprang out like ghosts. Aurora couldn't see exactly what happened. It was all too fast. Only the sound of fists, the snap of breaking bone, the guttural snarls, then the heavy thud of 2 bodies collapsing to the ground. When her eyes adjusted to the dark, she saw Tony's 2 men lying motionless on the concrete, blood spilling from their noses and mouths. And from the shadows behind the SUV, a man stepped forward, Kian Moretti. He wore a black shirt, sleeves pushed up to his elbows, revealing roped forearms and the faint suggestion of a tattoo along his skin. His face was still cold as stone, but his gray eyes burned with something dangerous as they took in the blood on her lip, the bruise already blooming on her cheek. "I told you to call if they came back." His voice was low and cold, but beneath it ran something like restrained anger. Aurora stood there trembling, her legs unsteady, blood still seeping at the corner of her mouth. She wanted to say something hard. She wanted to hold on to her pride. But tonight, her pride had been ground into the dirt under the boots of men who hunted human beings. "How did you know I was here?" she asked, her voice rough. Kian looked at her for a long moment, then answered with a calm that made it sound like the most obvious thing in the world. "I know everything that happens in this city." He shrugged off the coat draped over his shoulders, stepped closer, and wrapped it around her. Aurora wanted to refuse, wanted to say she didn't need it, but her body was shaking from cold and fear, and the warmth of his coat, still carrying the trace of expensive cologne, made her weaken. "Get in the car," Kian said. Not an offer, an order. Aurora looked at him, then at the 2 men groaning on the ground, then back at the black SUV with its dark, tinted windows. She had no choice. She knew it. If she refused, if she tried to run alone again, Tony would find her. He would always find her. And next time, no one might arrive in time. She climbed in and slid onto the soft leather back seat, and for the first time in the long nightmare of a night, she felt safe. Kian sat down beside her, tapped lightly on the partition, and the SUV glided smoothly into the New York darkness. Aurora didn't know where she was being taken. She didn't ask. She just sat there, curled inside the coat of a Mafia boss, watching the city slide past beyond the glass, and wondering whether she'd escaped one trap only to step into another, or whether this was truly a door opening onto a new life. Her phone vibrated. A message from Regina. "You think you can run? Tony will find you, no matter where you hide." Aurora turned the phone off, shoved it into her pocket, and stared out the window. Ahead, through the night, she caught the outline of a massive mansion coming into view, lights glittering like a castle in a fairy tale. But Aurora knew this wasn't a fairy tale. This was Kian Moretti's world, and she had just stepped into it. The SUV glided through a massive iron gate, guarded by 2 men in black suits, then crept up a winding stone drive threaded between rows of ancient trees. Aurora sat in the back seat, eyes wide, watching the scene unfold as if she'd crossed into another world. The Moretti estate rose in the Alpine section of New Jersey, where the wealthiest people in America lived. The building stretched like a European castle, with white stone columns, soaring windows, and hundreds of lights shimmering in the night. The front grounds were as large as the entire apartment complex where Aurora lived, complete with a marble fountain and silent angel statues standing watch. The vehicle stopped at the main entrance, and before Aurora could even step out, the heavy oak doors swung open, and a small figure shot forward like a bullet. "Miss Aurora!" Zane, still in superhero pajamas, raced down the stone steps, barreled straight into her, and wrapped both arms around her leg. "I knew Dad would save you. I told him. I told him he had to go rescue my wife right away." Aurora froze, looking down at the boy staring up at her with eyes bright as stars, even though it was 2 a.m. Her throat tightened, and a strange warmth spread through her chest, a feeling she couldn't explain. "You're still awake at this hour?" she asked softly, her voice still raw from crying and screaming. "I couldn't sleep," Zane said, gripping her hand. "I was scared the witch would take you, so I begged Dad to go find you. My dad's really good, right? He beat the witch, didn't he?" Aurora didn't know whether to laugh or cry. She knelt and pulled him into her arms, feeling the small heat of his slim body against her. "Yes," she whispered. "Your dad beat the witch." Kian stood there, silent, watching. His gray eyes rested on the sight of Aurora holding his son, and something flickered across his cold face, too fast for anyone to catch. "Zane," he said, his voice still deep but gentler when he spoke to the boy. "Take Miss Aurora inside. Let her rest." "I want to sleep with Miss Aurora," Zane declared, clinging to her hand as if he feared she might disappear. "I'll protect her all night." Kian let out a breath, but he didn't object. A maid appeared and led Aurora and Zane inside. The mansion was even more magnificent than Aurora had imagined, with a grand hall that soared upward, twin marble staircases, and oil paintings worth a fortune lining the walls. Yet beneath all the luxury, Aurora felt a chill, an emptiness, as if this house was missing something essential. Warmth, laughter, a real family. Zane tugged her toward his bedroom, a vast space with a canopy bed shaped like a fortress, toys piled high, and a mural of a castle painted across the wall. He climbed onto the mattress, pulled Aurora down beside him, then hugged her arm the way a child hugs a teddy bear. "Will you sing to me?" Zane whispered, his eyes already drooping with sleep. Aurora didn't know lullabies. Her mother had died when Aurora was too young to remember any songs at all, but she tried anyway, humming a wordless tune as her hand gently smoothed Zane's glossy black hair. He fell asleep within minutes, breathing evenly, his face peaceful as an angel. Aurora lay there a little longer, not wanting to leave, not wanting to break this rare moment of quiet, but she knew someone was waiting for her outside. Carefully, she eased Zane's arm away, tucked the blanket around him, and stepped out into the hall. Kian was there, leaning back against the wall, waiting. "Come with me," he said shortly, then turned and walked away. Aurora followed him downstairs into a room she guessed was a study. Books covered the walls. A massive oak desk sat at the center. Behind it hung a portrait of a middle-aged man Aurora assumed was Kian's father. Kian poured 2 glasses of liquor and set one in front of her. Aurora didn't drink. She just watched him, waiting. "Do you know who you were sold to?" Kian asked, his voice empty of emotion. Aurora shook her head, though she could already sense the answer wouldn't be gentle. "Regina, your stepmother, owes money to an underground gambling operation. To pay it off, she sold you to Frank Castellano." Kian paused, his gray eyes locking on hers. "Do you know who Frank Castellano is?" Aurora shook her head again, her throat going dry. "He's the biggest trafficker on the East Coast," Kian said, his voice dropping lower. "And he's the Moretti family's oldest enemy. My father and his father killed each other. My brother died because of his men. We've been at war for 30 years. Aurora felt her blood turn to ice. She hadn't just been sold into a trafficking ring. She'd been sold to the enemy of the man standing in front of her. "You're a pawn between 2 forces now," Kian continued, his tone flat, unshaken. "Castellano won't let this go. He'll come looking for you. Not because you're valuable, but because I saved you. Touching what's mine is touching the Moretti family. He'll want to prove no one can steal his prey." Aurora sank into the chair, her legs no longer strong enough to keep her standing. It was too much to take in. She was just a waitress who wanted a quiet life. How had she been dragged into a war between powers she couldn't even imagine? "So what do you want?" she asked, exhausted. Kian studied her for a long moment, as if weighing each word. "Stay here," he said. "Take care of Zane. In return, I protect you and I handle your family. Regina, Brittany, all of them. They'll never lay a hand on you again." Aurora gave a bitter laugh. "So what would I be? A bird in a golden cage? A luxury slave?" Something flashed in Kian's eyes, a glint Aurora couldn't read. "You'll be my son's caregiver. Nothing more. Nothing less." Aurora stood, facing him even though she had to tilt her head back because he was nearly a full head taller. "I have a condition," she said, her voice firmer than she expected. "I work. I get paid like any other employee. I don't take charity. I don't owe anyone." Kian was silent for a moment. Then the corner of his mouth lifted slightly, almost a smile, but not quite. "Fine," he said with a nod, and in those cold gray eyes Aurora caught a brief spark that looked like respect. "The contract starts tomorrow." On her first morning in the Moretti mansion, Aurora woke with a strange, disorienting feeling when she realized she was lying on the softest bed she'd ever touched in her life. The guest room they'd prepared for her was 5 times larger than her miserable Bronx apartment, with silk curtains, a carpet so thick her feet sank into it when she walked, and a private bathroom with a huge marble tub. But she didn't have time to take it all in. A rapid knock came at the door, and then Zane burst into the room like a tiny whirlwind. "Miss Aurora's awake. I've been waiting for you all morning." He bounced onto the bed, grabbed her hand, and tried to pull her up. "Come on, I'll show you my house. My house is really big. It's got a pool, a garden, and even a game room." Aurora couldn't refuse those shining, eager eyes. She let Zane lead her through the estate, past a living room filled with Italian leather sofas, past a dining room with a table long enough to seat 20 people, past a kitchen with a granite island and rows of sleek appliances she didn't even know the names of. Zane chattered nonstop about every corner, about the spot he liked to hide when he played hide-and-seek with the bodyguards, about the tree in the garden he'd named Old Bluebeard, about the swimming pool he wasn't allowed to go into by himself. Then they reached Zane's bedroom, and Aurora stopped short. On the nightstand, beside a star-shaped lamp, was a long line of medicine bottles, at least 7 or 8 different kinds, with complicated names and dosages carefully marked in red ink. Aurora stared at the bottles, then looked down at Zane. The boy had gone still. His smile faded, and his small shoulders drew in, as if he'd been caught doing something wrong. "Zane," Aurora said, kneeling so she was level with his eyes, her voice gentle. "Are these medicines yours?" Zane nodded, eyes fixed on the floor. "I'm sick," he whispered. So quietly Aurora had to lean closer to hear him. "My heart is broken." Aurora's own heart felt like it was being squeezed in a fist. "What do you mean broken, sweetheart?" Zane sat on the bed, his tiny hands pressing against the left side of his chest. "The doctor said my heart isn't strong enough. It doesn't pump blood the right way. I have to wait for a new heart." He looked up at Aurora, his eyes clear and bright, yet holding a sadness far too large for someone his age. "I've been waiting 10 months. The new heart still hasn't come." Aurora felt tears rising, her throat tightening with bitterness. She'd heard of this illness, congenital heart disease, children born with hearts that weren't complete, waiting in despair for a transplant that might never arrive. And Zane, the mischievous little boy with the radiant smile, the boy who had proposed to her in a dark storage room, the boy who'd declared himself her knight, who would protect her from the witch, was carrying a ticking bomb inside his chest. "I hate doctors," Zane went on, his voice trembling. "They're always sticking needles in me. It hurts a lot. And then they talk to Dad in that sad voice, and then Dad doesn't smile anymore. I hate making Dad sad." Aurora didn't speak. She only pulled the boy into her arms, holding him tight, as if she could use her embrace to shield him from every pain in the world. Zane cried, a small muffled sound, his shoulders shaking against her. "Miss Aurora," he whispered into her shoulder, "are you going to leave me? My mom left me, because I'm broken." The words drove straight through Aurora like a blade. His mother had left because he was sick. How long had this 6-year-old child carried that fear of being abandoned? "No," Aurora said, her own voice breaking. "I won't leave you. I promise. I'll be with you every time you go to the doctor. I'll hold your hand when they use the needles. I won't let you be alone." Zane lifted his head, eyes red and wet, but a spark of hope was beginning to return. "You promise? Pinky promise?" Aurora smiled through tears and held out her little finger. "I promise. Pinky promise." Zane hooked his tiny finger around hers, and his smile came back, even with tears still clinging to his lashes. That night, after dinner, Aurora took Zane to bed. He made her tell him stories, then begged her to sing, even though she'd told him she was terrible at it. But Aurora sang anyway, the same wordless melody from the night before, her voice rough and awkward. Yet Zane listened as if it were the most beautiful music in the world. He drifted off with a smile on his lips, his hand still gripping hers. Aurora stayed beside the bed a while longer, watching Zane's peaceful face and praying silently, even though she didn't know who she was praying to, that someone would give this boy a new heart, that he would be granted the chance to live, to grow up, to become the knight he dreamed of being. She didn't know that outside the bedroom door, Kian Moretti was standing in the darkness, his back against the wall, listening to every clumsy note of her humming. His steel-gray eyes watched through the narrow crack of the half-open door, watching her seated beside his son's bed, and for the first time in many long years of ice, those eyes softened, like snow melting under the first sunlight of spring. The days that followed drifted by, and Aurora began to find a new rhythm inside the Moretti mansion, a rhythm she'd never imagined she could have. Every morning she woke to Zane's eager knocking, the boy bursting into her room with endless energy, even though, some nights, he'd had to swallow as many as 4 different medicines. "Miss Aurora, can we make star-shaped pancakes today?" Zane would tug her hand and drag her down to the kitchen, where the family's private chef already had the ingredients set out, then stepped back to give the two of them space. Aurora wasn't good at cooking. In the years she'd lived under Regina's heel, she'd only been allowed to eat leftovers, never mind standing in a kitchen and making something of her own. But for Zane, she learned. She let him pour the batter, even when it splattered across the countertop. She helped him press cookie cutters into the pancakes, even when most of the stars came out crooked and missing points. And Zane laughed, and that clear, ringing laughter was the most beautiful sound Aurora had ever heard. At noon they sat in the reading room, the glass-walled space that looked out over the garden, where sunlight poured in warm and gentle. Aurora read aloud to Zane from stories about knights and princesses, dragons and castles, impossible adventures that glittered like dreams. Zane curled against her, his head resting on her shoulder, his eyes closed, yet he still mouthed the words as if he didn't want to miss a single line. After reading came drawing time. Zane drew constantly, and in most of his pictures there were 3 figures: a tall, dark-haired man, a tiny little boy, and a girl with long brown hair. "This is our family," Zane explained, pointing at his newest drawing. "Dad, me, and Miss Aurora. We're a family, right?" Aurora didn't know how to answer. She only hugged him and nodded. The afternoons were the hardest. That was appointment time, the hour Zane hated most. But Aurora kept her promise. She held his hand all the way to the hospital. She stayed beside him while the nurse prepared the needle. She told jokes to pull his mind away. "Zane, do you know why an octopus never shares its toys?" Zane shook his head, his eyes still fixed on the needle inching closer. "Because it's selfish?" "No, because it has 8 arms, so it can hug all the toys at once." Zane burst out laughing right as the needle went in, and his laughter covered the small, sharp gasp of pain he tried to swallow. Aurora squeezed his hand, and when it was over, she rewarded him with an ice cream and a kiss to his forehead. Evenings were the strangest part. Before, the servants said, Kian rarely came home before 9 at night. His work, though no one ever said exactly what it was, kept him out late. But lately he'd started coming back earlier, 6 o'clock, then 5:30, then exactly 5. Dinner became a meal for 3. Kian sat at the head of the table, with Aurora and Zane on either side. Zane chattered about his day, the star-shaped pancakes, the new drawing, Aurora's jokes. Kian listened, nodding, and sometimes the corner of his mouth lifted when Zane said something especially ridiculous. And Aurora realized, even though she tried not to notice, that Kian's gray eyes kept lingering on her, glances that lasted a few seconds longer than they needed to, accidental brushes of their hands when they reached for the bread plate at the same time, moments when she looked up and caught him watching her, and then they both looked away as if nothing had happened. One evening, in the middle of dinner, Zane suddenly spoke up. "Dad, why do you look at Miss Aurora so much?" Kian nearly choked on his water. Aurora felt heat rush into her face. "I'm not looking at Miss Aurora," Kian said, his voice going stiff. Zane tilted his head, mischievous. "Yes, you are. You look at Miss Aurora the way you look at your favorite pizza, like you want to eat it right up." Aurora didn't know whether to laugh or cry. She stared down at her plate, fighting the smile rising at the corners of her mouth. Kian cleared his throat and switched the subject fast, but the tips of his ears had turned red. That night, Aurora couldn't sleep. She went downstairs for water and saw light spilling from the study. She meant to turn back, but her feet carried her to the door that was slightly open. Kian sat in an armchair, a glass of liquor in his hand, already more than half gone. He wasn't wearing a suit the way he did during the day, only a black shirt with the top buttons undone, showing the hard lines of his chest. The dark hair he usually kept so neatly swept back was slightly mussed now, falling across his forehead. He looked tired, but he also looked more human, less frightening. "Come in," he said without turning around. As if he'd known she was there from the beginning, Aurora stepped inside and sat in the chair across from him. They were quiet for a long time, with only the clock ticking and the faint clink of ice against glass. "Vanessa, my ex-wife," Kian said suddenly, his voice slightly blurred by alcohol. "She left when Zane was first diagnosed." Aurora didn't speak. She just listened. "She said she couldn't stand watching our son die a little at a time," Kian went on, his eyes fixed on nothing. "She said her heart wasn't strong enough to see it. Then she flew to Monaco with some oil tycoon and left me with a 3-year-old whose heart was already close to stopping." He tipped his head back and drained the rest of his drink. "After that, I built everything. This empire, these walls, this coldness. I swore I'd never let anyone into my heart again, because love is weakness, and weakness gets you killed in my world." Aurora looked at him, at the most powerful man in New York sitting there with the face of someone badly hurt. She didn't judge him. She didn't offer cheap comfort. She simply sat there, silent beside him, letting him know he wasn't alone. And that night, for the first time in many years, Kian Moretti didn't drink alone. 2 weeks inside the Moretti mansion passed like a dream Aurora didn't dare believe was real. She'd started to grow used to the new rhythm, to Zane's laughter every morning, to the way Kian's gaze lingered a little too long each evening, to the feeling of belonging somewhere for the first time in her life. But every dream has a moment when it's shaken awake. That afternoon, Aurora and Zane were sitting in the living room, the boy trying to teach her a video game she didn't understand beyond mashing buttons at random, when the front doors swung open. No knock, no announcement, only the sharp click of high heels on marble, echoing through the house like war drums. Aurora looked up and saw a woman stride in. She was around 60, yet she still carried the sharp beauty of her youth. Platinum hair was swept into a neat, high twist, and her eyes were the same gray as Kian's, only colder, sharper, like twin blades cutting through the room. She wore an elegant black dress, pearls at her throat, and her whole presence radiated a frightening authority that made Aurora rise without thinking. "Grandmother," Zane cried, but he didn't run in for a hug the way he usually did with Aurora. He stayed where he was, his smile fading, as if instinct warned him something was wrong. Carmela Moretti, the true power behind the Moretti Empire, let her gaze travel around the living room. Then it stopped on Aurora, raking her from head to toe with undisguised contempt. Aurora felt stripped under that look, every flaw exposed. Hair not glossy enough, skin not bright enough, clothes expensive yet still unable to hide the fact she'd once been a waitress. "Where is Kian?" Carmela asked, her voice cold as ice. Before Aurora could answer, footsteps sounded on the stairs. Kian appeared, still in a black suit, his face unreadable. But Aurora saw his jaw tighten when he looked at his mother. "Mother," he said, without a trace of warmth. "You didn't call first." "Do I need permission to enter my son's home?" Carmela replied, then turned back to Aurora, this time not even bothering to hide her disgust. "Kian, what is this? You're bringing waitresses home now?" Aurora felt as if she'd been slapped. She wasn't unfamiliar with contempt. Regina and Brittany had taught her that for years, but there was something in Carmela's tone, in the way she looked at Aurora like she was an insect, that hurt more than any blow. "Aurora is Zane's caregiver," Kian said, his voice steady, yet something simmered beneath it. "She's here by my invitation." Carmela gave a short, scornful laugh that rang through the room. "A caregiver? Kian, don't be naive. I hear she eats dinner at your table, stays in the family wing, takes my grandson to his appointments. That's not how you treat staff." She stepped closer to Aurora, her heels striking the floor with each deliberate tap. "Who are you? A waitress with no mother and no father, sold by her own family to a trafficking ring, and now you think you can climb into my son's bed and change your life?" Aurora opened her mouth to defend herself, but before a word could come out, a small blur launched from the sofa. Zane ran to Aurora and wrapped both arms around her leg, lifting his small face toward his grandmother with a rare, furious glare. "Grandma, you can't say bad things about Miss Aurora," he shouted, his voice shaking but determined. "She is my wife, You can't kick my wife out." Carmela went pale, her eyes widening in shock. "Wife? What is this boy talking about?" "Zane," Kian said, his voice softer when he spoke to his son. "Go to your room." "No." Zane clung tighter to Aurora. "I'm not going anywhere. I'm not letting Grandma kick Miss Aurora out." Kian came down the stairs and moved to stand between his mother and Aurora. He was almost a head taller than Carmela, and for the first time Aurora saw that powerful woman forced to look up at her son. "Aurora stays," Kian said, each word firm as a nail driven into wood. "This is my decision, not yours." Carmela narrowed her eyes, her mouth tightening into a thin line. "You're being reckless, Kian. The Benedetti family won't be pleased when they learn you refused their daughter for a nobody." "I don't care what the Benedetti family thinks," Kian said, "and I don't care what you think about this either." The air in the room grew so thick it felt hard to breathe. Two pairs of identical gray eyes locked in a stare. On one side, the authority of a mother who had ruled the family for 30 years. On the other, the stubborn will of a son who no longer bowed. Finally, Carmela stepped back. She wasn't defeated. Aurora understood that. She was retreating. Tactical. For now. Before she left, she turned and fixed Aurora with a gaze cold as a serpent's. "You don't belong in this world," she said, her voice gentle, but threaded with threat. "Sooner or later you'll be crushed, and when it happens, I'll sit right here and watch." She walked out, heels clicking like a countdown to the end of the world, and disappeared into the Rolls-Royce waiting outside. That night, Aurora couldn't sleep. She sat on the bed, staring at the suitcase she'd never fully unpacked since arriving. Maybe Carmela was right. She didn't belong here. She was only a waitress with a stained past, and she'd brought trouble to Kian, to Zane, to this whole family. She should leave, before things got worse. She began folding clothes into the suitcase, silent tears dropping onto shirts she still wasn't used to wearing. At 2 a.m, she went down the stairs, suitcase rolling behind her, intending to slip out the back. But a figure was waiting at the bottom of the staircase. "Kian, where do you think you're going?" he asked, his deep voice filling the darkness. Aurora didn't look at him. She was afraid that if she met those gray eyes, she wouldn't be able to leave. "I don't want to cause you more trouble," she said, her voice catching. "Your mother is right. I don't belong here." Kian stepped forward and blocked the door. "Do you think I let my mother decide who gets to stay in my house?" Aurora still wouldn't lift her gaze. "But she's your mother, and I'm just—" "You're the person my son loves most in the world right now," Kian cut in, his voice suddenly softer. "If you leave, you'll break his heart before he even gets a new one." Aurora looked up, and she saw Kian watching her with an expression she'd never seen on him before. No coldness, no distance, only honesty, and something that looked like fear, afraid of losing her. "Stay," he said, not as an order, but almost like a plea. "Please." Aurora looked at him, then at the suitcase in her hand, and slowly, she set it down. A week after the confrontation with Carmela, Aurora thought everything had finally settled back into place. Zane still laughed and joked every day. Kian still came home early every evening, and she had slowly begun to forget the threat in the powerful woman's voice. But the ghosts of the past never truly disappear. That afternoon, Aurora took Zane to the park near the estate, the place he loved to run even though the doctors had warned he shouldn't push himself too hard. 2 bodyguards followed as usual, keeping a few yards back to give them space. Aurora sat on a stone bench, watching Zane chase a butterfly with that bright, crystalline laugh, and she smiled. Peaceful moments like this were something she'd once believed she would never be allowed to have. Her phone vibrated. A text from an unknown number. Aurora opened it, and the blood in her veins turned to ice. It was a photo. A picture of her and Zane in the park, taken no more than 10 minutes earlier. Zane was smiling, his hand in hers, and someone had drawn a red circle around the boy's face. Underneath was a message. $100,000, or the kid will have an accident. You have 48 hours. Aurora jerked her head up, scanning the park in horror. Someone was watching her. Right now. Right here. She rushed Zane back to the car, telling the bodyguards she had a headache and needed to go home. All the way back, she couldn't stop shaking, her arms wrapped around the boy as if someone might snatch him from her at any second. That night, another message came. This time there was a phone number to call back. She knew who it was before she even pressed it. "Long time no see, you bitch." Regina's voice hissed through the line, bitter and venomous. "You thought you could hide from me? I know where you are. I know how much that little boy matters to you. 100,000, Aurora. Or I'll make sure people know where he goes to school, where he goes for his appointments, and what routes he takes. Aurora felt nausea rise in her throat. I don't have $100,000. You're sleeping with the richest mafia boss in New York and you don't have money? Regina let out a harsh laugh. Don't lie to me. Figure it out. 48 hours. The call cut off. Aurora sat in the dark, trembling. She could tell Kian. He could handle it. He had an army, an empire, enough power to grind Regina into dust. But then what? Kian would kill Regina. Aurora knew it as surely as she knew the sun rose in the east. And even if Regina was a demon, even after all the years of cruelty, Aurora didn't want to carry the weight of a human life on her conscience, even in enemies. So she decided to handle it herself. The next day, Aurora secretly gathered all the money she'd managed to save from the salary Kian paid her. $15,000. Everything she had. She sent Regina a message asking to meet and negotiate. Regina agreed, setting the meeting at a filthy bar on the outskirts of Brooklyn, in a place where even the streetlights didn't bother to reach. Aurora told Zane she had to go out for a little while, promised she'd be back before dinner. The boy hugged her hard, as if he sensed something. Come back soon, Zane whispered. I'll wait for you. Aurora kissed his forehead, fighting back tears, and walked out the door. She didn't know that from a second-floor window, Kian was watching her leave with eyes full of suspicion. The bar was worse than Aurora had imagined. The stink of beer and liquor, cigarette smoke, despair. Regina sat in a dark corner with Brittany beside her, both of them watching Aurora with poisonous smiles. You actually came? Regina sneered as Aurora set the envelope of money on the table. Let's see. How much did you bring? Regina counted, then tossed the envelope back onto the table with open contempt. 15,000? You sleep with a mafia boss and this is all you've got? You're useless. It's everything I have, Aurora said, forcing her voice steady. Please, leave me alone. I'll get more, I promise, but please don't touch Zane. Regina stared at her with cold eyes, then suddenly burst out laughing. Not the laugh of someone getting paid, but the laugh of someone who'd already won. You think I really want money, you idiot? Aurora didn't even have time to understand before the bar door slammed open. Tony Marchetti walked in, his scarred face still bruised from the last time someone had put a bullet through his knee. Two men trailing behind him like shadows. Hello, sweetheart, Tony grinned, his yellowed gold teeth gleaming under the dirty light. This time nobody's coming to save you. Aurora sprang up, trying to run, but Brittany blocked the exit. Regina laughed like she'd lost her mind. I sold you to Tony a long time ago, you bitch. The money was just an excuse to lure you out of Moretti's little castle. And you were stupid enough to walk straight into the trap. Tony's men grabbed Aurora and hauled her toward the back door. She screamed, clawed, kicked, but the hands clamped on her like steel didn't loosen. Somebody help me! Please! Her cries echoed down the dark alley, and no one even turned their head. This was Brooklyn at 8 at night. No one cared about a girl screaming. Aurora was dragged through the dark alley, her fingernails scraping across the rough concrete until they split and bled, her throat shredded from screaming, and still no one answered. Tony Marchetti followed behind, laughing loud and ugly as if he were watching a comedy. He was still limping from the time he'd been shot, but it didn't dull the madness in his eyes. This time Moretti won't save you, sweetheart, he said with vicious delight. I'm sending you to Mexico before dawn. The private docks are only a few hours from here. Aurora felt her hope draining away one drop at a time. She'd been stupid. She'd told herself she could handle it alone, that she could protect Zane without anyone's help. And now she was about to pay for that mistake with her entire life. A black truck was waiting at the end of the alley, its back doors thrown open like the mouth of a monster, ready to swallow her whole. One of Tony's men lifted her off the ground, getting ready to hurl her into the lightless cargo space. Then gunfire exploded. Not one shot, but a rapid burst, so loud and sharp Aurora thought her eardrums might rupture. The man holding her released her and crashed face down to the ground, a bullet hole drilled into his shoulder. The other one spun, yanking out his gun, but before he could fire, a bullet punched into his knee. He howled, collapsing, his weapon skittering across the pavement. Aurora rolled out of their reach, shaking hard, eyes wide as she stared toward the source of the shots. Two of Kian's bodyguards, the men she'd assumed were back at the mansion, stepped out of the shadows with guns in their hands, faces cold and mechanical. like killing machines. They'd been watching her. From beginning to end, Tony Marchetti drew his own weapon and tried to shoot back. But a figure surged in from behind, kicked the gun out of Tony's hand, then drove a fist straight into his face with such force Tony went sprawling. Kian Moretti. He stood in the dark without his usual suit, wearing only a black shirt with the sleeves shoved up, the veins on his forearms standing out like cords. His dark hair was a mess, and his stormy, intense look, eyes that were usually ice-cold, were now burning, bloodshot with a rage Aurora had never seen. He grabbed Tony by the collar, hauled him upright, and hit him, again and again and again, each punch like a crack of thunder, blood spraying from Tony's nose and mouth. "You think you can touch what's mine?" Kian roared, his voice no longer sounding human, more like an animal defending its territory. "How do you want to die?" Tony couldn't answer. His mouth was full of blood, his eyes swollen nearly shut. Kian drew a gun from his waistband and aimed it straight at Tony's head. Aurora screamed, "Don't!" Kian stopped and turned toward her, his eyes still red with fury. Aurora was shaking, but she forced herself to shake her head. "Please," she begged, her voice breaking. "Don't kill him in front of me." Silence stretched, long and endless. Then Kian lowered the gun, but instead of putting it away, he fired into Tony's other knee. Tony's scream ripped through the alley, but Kian didn't even look at him. He turned, walked to Aurora, shrugged off the coat he'd been wearing, and draped it over her shoulders. "Home?" he said. Only 2 words, his voice still trembling with anger. All the way back, Kian didn't speak. He sat beside Aurora in the car, his hand crushing the edge of the seat until his knuckles went white, his jaw locked so tight Aurora could hear the grind of his teeth. She wanted to explain. She wanted to apologize. But the weight of his silence kept her mouth shut. When they reached the mansion, Kian walked straight into his study and slammed the door. Seconds later came the crash of breaking glass, then a low, furious growl, then more things shattering. Aurora stood outside the door, tears streaming down her face. She'd made him angry. She'd made him worry. She'd almost died because of her own foolishness. The door jerked open. Kian stood there with his sleeves rolled to his elbows, a few drops of blood sliding from his hand onto the floor, probably from a cut where he'd smashed a glass. His gray eyes still burned, but now it wasn't only anger. There was pain in them, and fear. "Why?" he asked, his voice low and shaking. "Why didn't you tell me?" Aurora sobbed. "Because I didn't want you to kill them. No matter what they are, they're still my family. They were the only people I had for my entire life. I hate them. I despise them. But I don't want to carry the weight of killing them on my back." She crumpled, her knees hitting the floor, her whole body trembling with raw, uncontrollable sobs. "You don't understand," she shouted through tears. "You don't know what it feels like to be beaten by your own family, starved, locked in a closet for days, just because you dared to eat a leftover piece of bread. You don't know what it feels like to be called useless, a parasite, unwanted, since you were a child. I spent my whole life trying to believe there was still something human left in them, but they sold me. They sold me like I was an object." Kian stood there, silent, watching her fall apart in front of him. Then slowly, he knelt down. One hand lifted her chin. The other wiped away the tears that wouldn't stop spilling down her cheeks. "They don't deserve you," he said, his voice softening, gentle enough Aurora almost thought she'd imagined it. "They don't deserve a single tear from you. They never did." He pulled her into his arms and held her tight, and Aurora cried the way she'd never been allowed to cry, every pain she'd hidden for 27 years bursting out like a dam breaking. Kian didn't say anything else. He just held her, one hand smoothing her hair, his lips brushing her forehead with a kiss as light as a butterfly's wings. "From now on," he whispered, "you're mine. No one touches you again." Aurora cried until she fell asleep in his arms, and that night, for the first time in her life, she felt truly protected. Kian Moretti looked down at the woman asleep in his arms, her face still streaked with tears, her long lashes trembling as if even in her dreams she was still crying. He didn't know how long they'd been sitting on the study floor, maybe an hour, maybe 2. But his legs had gone numb, and his arms ached with exhaustion, and yet he didn't dare move, afraid he'd wake her, afraid he'd shatter this fragile moment. Carefully, he rose and lifted her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. She was lighter than he'd expected, so light it made him wonder how much the years of being starved had taken from her. He carried her up the stairs, through the endless corridors, and into her room. After laying her on the bed, he pulled the blanket up over her and his fingers, without thinking, smoothed a loose strand of hair that had fallen across her forehead. Then he simply stood there, watching her. Kian Moretti, the boss of the most infamous Mafia empire on the East Coast, the man the entire New York underworld feared, was standing beside the bed of a waitress and couldn't tear his eyes away. He tried to remember the last time he'd felt like this. His heart was racing, his hands were unsteady, a strange fear braided together with a hunger to protect someone at any cost. And then he remembered. 7 years ago, the day Zane was born, he had stood beside his son's crib, watching that tiny life sleep, and he had sworn he would protect him with his own. He'd thought that would be the only time in his life he would ever feel this way. He had been wrong. Kian walked to the window and looked out at the night sky, already paling into the gray of dawn. He remembered the day Vanessa left, the day he'd thought the world had collapsed. Not because he loved her. He'd stopped loving Vanessa long before that, but because she abandoned their son, a 3-year-old child with a broken heart, a child who needed his mother more than anyone. "I can't stand watching him die little by little," Vanessa had said, tears running down her face. But they were tears for herself, not for Zane. "I need to live, Kian. I can't bury my youth in a hospital." And then she left. She flew to Monaco with an oil tycoon she'd been secretly seeing for an entire year. She left Kian with a sick child and a shattered heart. That night, Kian had sworn an oath. He swore he would never let anyone into his heart again. He swore he would build walls so high no one could climb them. He swore he would become ice, become steel, become something that couldn't be hurt. And he had done it. For 7 years, he had been the Kian Moretti the world knew. Cold, ruthless, stripped of human softness. Women came and went. No one stayed longer than a night. No one was allowed inside the mansion. No one was allowed to meet Zane. Until this girl appeared. Aurora Bennett, the girl hiding in a dark storage room of a cheap Italian restaurant, sold by her own family to a trafficking ring, with nothing but pride and a heart already broken. She should have been afraid of him. Everyone was afraid of him. But she wasn't. She looked him straight in the eye and said, "I don't need anyone to save me," with a hard voice, even while she trembled with fear. She set conditions when he offered help, insisting on working, on being paid, on refusing charity. She faced his mother, the powerful woman even the Moretti Empire had to respect, and she didn't back down. And more than anything, she loved Zane. Not because Zane was the son of a billionaire, not because she wanted to please Kian, but because she truly loved the boy, unconditionally, the way Vanessa should have loved him, and never did. Kian didn't know when it had happened. Maybe the first time he stood outside Zane's room and heard her lull his son to sleep with her rough, clumsy humming. Maybe when he'd seen her hold Zane as he cried in the hospital after each blood draw. Maybe when she looked at Kian with eyes that held no fear at all and said, "I don't belong here." The wall he had built for 7 years began to crack, and tonight, as he held her in his arms, felt her warmth, heard her sobbing, that wall had collapsed completely. A small sound at the doorway made Kian turn. Zane was standing there, his eyes red and swollen, as if he'd been crying ever since Aurora left. "Dad," the boy whispered, his voice trembling. "Is Miss Aurora okay? I heard her crying. I'm scared." Kian moved to him and knelt to Zane's height. He looked into his son's clear eyes just like his own but filled with an innocence he had lost long ago. "She'll be okay," he said, his voice gentle in a way it was with no one but Zane. "I promise." Zane glanced over his father's shoulder at Aurora, sleeping on the bed, then looked back at him with a seriousness that didn't belong on a 7-year-old face. "Dad," he whispered, as if sharing the most important secret of his life, "remember to protect my wife, okay? I love Miss Aurora so much. I don't want to lose her like I lost Mom." Kian's heart clenched as if a fist had closed around it. He pulled his son into his arms, burying his face in Zane's soft hair, his eyes fixed on Aurora sleeping peacefully. "I'll protect both of you," he said, and for the first time in 7 years, Kian Moretti made a new vow. Not a vow to freeze his heart, a vow to protect the 2 most important people in his life, at any cost. A week had passed since that night, a week that made Aurora feel as if she were walking on clouds. Kian no longer kept his distance the way he used to. He was still cold to the outside world, but with her his gaze had changed, softer, warmer, as if a small flame were smoldering behind those smoldering ash-colored eyes. Regina and Brittany had been arrested. Aurora heard from the bodyguards that Kian had turned them over to the police, along with all the evidence of trafficking, and they would serve at least 20 years in prison. Tony Marchetti had fared even worse. He'd been handed to the FBI like a gift, along with an entire file on Frank Castellano's network. Aurora didn't ask for details. She knew she shouldn't know, but she did know the ghosts of her past would no longer haunt her, and today was special. Zane's birthday, 7 years old. The boy had asked his father for only one thing. No big party, no guests, just the three of them, Dad, Miss Aurora, and him. "Because we're a family," Zane had said with a huge grin. "Families don't need anyone else." Aurora got up at 5 in the morning to make his birthday cake. Everyone knew she wasn't good at cooking, but she'd secretly watched tutorial videos for nights. Tried again and again, at least 3 times this week, with the chef's quiet help. The cake wasn't perfect. The frosting leaned a little. The sugar stars she'd shaped were slightly lopsided. But it was the first cake Aurora had ever made for anyone in her life. Zane stared at it with eyes shining as if he'd just been handed treasure. "You made this for me?" he asked, his voice trembling with emotion. "This is the prettiest cake I've ever seen." Aurora laughed, her eyes stinging. "It's crooked." "No, it isn't." Zane shook his head hard. "It's perfect because you made it for me. My mom never made cake for me." The boy's innocent words left both Aurora and Kian silent for a moment. Kian stood beside them holding an enormous gift box Aurora knew was stuffed with enough toys to stock a small store. He'd bought an entire toy shop, literally, when the clerk said a few of the things Zane wanted were sold out. But watching his son clutch Aurora's crooked cake like it was sacred, Kian understood that none of those expensive toys could compare. That evening, the 3 of them sat around a dining table, decorated with balloons and tinsel. Zane sat in the middle wearing a sparkling birthday hat, his face brighter than any candlelight. When the cake was brought out with 7 flickering candles, Zane closed his eyes to make a wish. "You're supposed to wish in your head," Aurora reminded him. "If you say it out loud, it won't come true." But Zane shook his head and opened his eyes, looking at both adults with startling seriousness. "I want to say it out loud," he said, "because I want Dad and Miss Aurora to know what I'm wishing for." Then he took a deep breath and spoke, his clear voice filling the room. "I wish for a new heart, and I wish Miss Aurora would be my mom." Tears welled in Aurora's eyes before she could stop them. She looked at Kian and saw that his gray eyes were shining too, in a way they rarely did. Zane blew out the candles, then turned and threw his arms around Aurora. "Will you be my mom?" he whispered. "I promise I'll be good. I'll take my medicine. I won't be scared of doctors anymore. I just need you with me." Aurora held him tight, tears dropping into Zane's glossy black hair. She didn't answer, because she didn't know what words could hold something that big. But she promised herself that no matter what happened, she would never leave this boy. That night, after Zane fell asleep holding his new teddy bear, Aurora stood alone on the balcony, looking out at the garden washed in moonlight. She was thinking about Zane's wish, about what it meant, about a future she didn't dare dream of. Footsteps sounded behind her. She didn't need to turn to know who it was. "Why aren't you asleep?" Kian asked, stopping beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him but not touching. "I'm thinking," she said, "about Zane's wish." Silence hung between them for a while. Then Kian spoke, his voice low and rough in the quiet night. "You can leave whenever you want. You know that. The danger is over. Regina is arrested. Tony is arrested. No one is threatening you anymore. I'll give you money, a new identity, anything you need to start over." Aurora turned to look at him. In the moonlight, Kian's face looked softer, less frightening, and she could see the fragility he kept hidden behind his cold walls. "Do you want me to go?" she asked. Kian didn't answer right away. He studied her for a long moment, then let out a breath. "I want you to have a choice. I don't want you here because you feel you owe me, or because you have nowhere else to go." Aurora smiled, a gentle smile she'd never known how to wear before. "I know," she said, "but I want to be here. Not because I owe you, not because I have no choice, because I want to." Kian looked at her, his gray eyes bright in the dark. He stepped closer, lifted one hand, and brushed her cheek. His fingers trembled, as if he were touching something so precious he was afraid to break it. "You're driving me insane," he whispered, his voice rough. "I swore I'd never let anyone into my heart again. I built walls I thought no one could ever break. But you walked through them like they weren't there." Aurora covered his hand with hers, holding it against her cheek. "Then don't control it," she said softly. "Don't try to stop it." Kian watched her for one more beat, then he bent down and kissed her. Not gently, not carefully, but fierce and desperate, as if he'd held this back too long and couldn't endure another second. Aurora kissed him back, her fingers sliding into his hair, pulling him closer, and they stood there under the moonlight, merging as if the outside world no longer existed. When they finally separated, both of them were breathing hard. Kian rested his forehead against hers, eyes closed, his voice shaking as he whispered, "From now on, you're mine. Only mine." 2 weeks after that night on the balcony, life inside the Moretti mansion seemed to be washed in a new kind of light. Aurora and Kian no longer hid what they felt, even though they still kept it quiet in front of outsiders. But Zane knew, and the mischievous boy grinned every time he saw his father holding Miss Aurora's hand, loudly declaring, "I knew it. I told you Dad liked Miss Aurora a long time ago." But happiness, Aurora had learned from her own life, never lasted forever. The call came on a Tuesday morning, while the three of them were eating breakfast. Kian's phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen, then shot to his feet, his face changing by the second as he listened. Aurora watched him, her heart tightening with fear. But then Kian turned back with eyes blazing, a rare smile spreading across his mouth. "They found a heart," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "California. There's a donor who matches Zane perfectly. We have to fly to Los Angeles immediately." Aurora couldn't remember if she screamed, or cried, or both. She only remembered wrapping Zane in her arms, and the boy asking, "My new heart is here?" with wide, hopeful eyes. They flew to Los Angeles that very afternoon on Kian's private jet. Zane sat between Aurora and his father, gripping both their hands, asking non-stop about the new heart, asking whether he would be able to run like other children later, whether he wouldn't need to take so much medicine anymore. Aurora answered every question, trying to hide the happy tears threatening to spill, while Kian sat in silence, staring out the window, his hand clamped hard on the edge of the seat, as if he feared that if he loosened his grip, everything would vanish like a dream. The hospital in Los Angeles was one of the best cardiac hospitals in America. They were taken into the VIP wing, where a full team of doctors and nurses waited for them. Zane was examined one last time, and every test showed he was strong enough to endure the surgery. Everything was perfect, until the chief physician stepped into the room with a pallid face. Aurora knew something was wrong the moment she saw him. He couldn't meet their eyes, and his hands shook as he held the file. "I'm very sorry," he said, his voice gentle, as if afraid the words themselves would shatter the world. "The surgery has been cancelled." Kian sprang up. "What did you just say?" "The donor's family has withdrawn their consent," the doctor explained, shame and helplessness written all over him. "Someone contacted them and told them the paperwork was forged, that they were tricked into signing the consent forms. They hired a lawyer and threatened to sue the hospital. We had no other choice." Aurora felt as if all the air had been ripped from her lungs. She looked at Zane, sitting on the hospital bed with a small face full of confusion. "What's happening?" he asked, his voice trembling. "My new heart isn't coming anymore?" Aurora couldn't answer. Tears were already streaming down her cheeks, and all she could do was rush forward and hold him tight, as if her arms could shield him from this cruel reality. Zane didn't understand, but he saw Miss Aurora crying. He saw his father standing rigid as stone with a bloodless face, and then he began to cry too. "Why are you crying? Dad, why aren't you saying anything? I'm scared." Kian didn't speak. He turned away, walked out into the hall, and the sound of a punch cracked through the air. Aurora lifted her head toward the glass and saw Kian slamming his fist into the hospital wall, once, twice, 3 times, until his hand was slick with blood and the wall itself split. His bodyguards rushed to restrain him, but he shoved them off, his eyes red, his jaw clenched so tightly Aurora could almost hear his teeth grinding. Half an hour later, the report from Kian's people came through. The person who had contacted the donor's family, who had sent forged documents, who had hired a lawyer to threaten a lawsuit, all of it led back to one source: Carmela Moretti. Kian called his mother right in front of Aurora, put it on speaker, and the powerful woman's voice came through cold as ice. "Kian, I heard the news. What a pity. You did this," Kian said, his voice shaking with rage. "You just killed your grandson." Silence held for a few seconds, then Carmela sighed. I'm only saving the family from disgrace, Kian. Do you think I don't know what you're doing with that waitress? You plan to marry her? Give her the Moretti name? Let the whole world laugh at us? I can't allow that. By killing my son? Kian roared. Zane is your blood, your only grandson. Zane will find another heart, Carmela said calmly. But if that surgery succeeded, you would marry that girl to celebrate. I know you, and I can't permit it. The Benedetti family has promised you their daughter, and this alliance matters more than any girl. Kian stood there with the phone shaking in his hand, his gray eyes darkening like a sky before a storm. You're dead to me, he said, each word cold as ice. From this moment on, you are no longer my mother. You are not allowed near Zane, not allowed near Aurora, not allowed near anyone who belongs to me. If you dare step into this hospital, I will treat you the way I treat any enemy. He ended the call, hurled the phone into the wall, and it shattered into 100 pieces. Aurora held Zane in her arms, her tears falling without end. The boy fell asleep from exhaustion after crying, his breathing shallow and faster than usual. And that night, like a cruel curse, Zane's health worsened quickly. He spiked a high fever, his heart raced out of control, and the monitor screamed. Doctors ran in, nurses ran in, and Aurora was pushed out into the hallway, left only to stare through the glass while they fought to stabilize him. When things finally quieted, the chief physician stepped out with a heavy face. The emotional shock has weakened his heart significantly, he said, his voice low with sorrow. If we don't find a new heart within the next few weeks, possibly less, I'm afraid. He didn't finish the sentence, but Aurora understood. Zane was fading, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. 3 days in the hospital passed like 3 centuries. Aurora didn't leave Zane's room. She slept in the chair beside his bed, waking every time the monitor made an unfamiliar beep, praying to any god who might be listening to give the boy more time. Kian didn't leave either. He stood in the corner like a statue, his eyes never leaving his son, his hand constantly on the phone as he ordered his people to search for any possible donor heart anywhere in the world. But time wasn't on their side. Zane's condition worsened by the hour. He was so exhausted he no longer had the strength to talk. The eyes that had once sparkled now dull and sunken, and every breath he took sounded heavy, as if it might be his last. Aurora couldn't endure it anymore. She found the chief physician, pulled him into the hallway, and asked him point blank. There has to be a way, she said, her voice raw from sleeplessness and too much crying. Anything. I'll do anything. The doctor looked at her with deep compassion, then sighed. There is one method, he said slowly, but it's very risky, and it can only buy time. It's not a final solution. Tell me, Aurora pleaded. We can take a special portion of cardiac tissue from a living donor and implant it temporarily, he explained, to help stabilize Zane's heart while we keep waiting for a full transplant. But the donor must have perfectly compatible blood type and markers, and more importantly, the tissue retrieval is dangerous. There is about a 15% chance the donor won't survive. Aurora didn't need to think. Test me. The doctor's eyes widened. You don't understand. 15% isn't small. If you... Test me, Aurora cut him off, her voice turning to steel. If I'm compatible, I'll do it. The results came back that afternoon. Aurora was a perfect match for Zane, as if fate had set it in place from the day she met him in the dark storage room of that cheap Italian restaurant. She signed the consent forms without a second of hesitation, and then Kian found out. He stormed into the doctor's office like a hurricane, eyes bloodshot, his roar filling the hallway. No, I don't allow it. Cancel the surgery right now. The doctor faltered, looking from Kian to Aurora and back again. Aurora stepped forward to face the man she loved, the man looking at her with sheer desperation and fear. You don't have the right to decide this, she said, her voice calmer than she expected. This is my body. This is my decision. Aurora, you don't understand, Kian said, gripping her shoulders, his fingers tightening until it almost hurt. 15%. You could die. I can't lose you. And I can't watch Zane die, Aurora shouted back, tears spilling. Do you think I can live with myself if I sit here and watch that child go, while I could do something? Do you think I'd ever forgive myself? But if you die on that operating table, Kian said, his voice shaking, breaking, nothing left of the cold Mafia boss. I'll lose both of you. Do you understand? Both of you. My son and the woman I love. Aurora went still, It was the first time Kian had said those words out loud with such clarity. Not in darkness, not in a moment of losing control, but in the harsh light of day, with all the desperation and fear of a man staring at the edge of losing everything. "I love you, Aurora," Kian went on, his hand lifting to her face, his fingers trembling as they touched her cheek wet with tears. "I tried to fight it. I built walls. I kept my distance. But you broke all of it. You're the first person after Vanessa I've let into my heart. And if I lose you, I don't know if I'll survive it," Aurora cried, sobbing as if she'd never been allowed to cry before. Then she threw her arms around him and held on like this might be the last time. "I love you too," she whispered into his chest. "I love you and I love Zane, and that's why I have to do this. If I lose Zane, I'll die with him. Do you understand? That boy saved me the day I thought I was going to lose everything. He proposed to me when no one in this world wanted me. I owe him a life, and I'll pay with my own if I have to." Kian held her so tightly, his face buried in her hair, and Aurora felt his shoulders shaking. The most feared Mafia boss in New York was crying because the woman he loved was putting her life on the line to save his son. "You won't die," Aurora said softly, her hand rubbing his back. "I promise. I'll come back to you, and to Zane. You have to believe me." Kian didn't answer. He only held her harder, as if the strength of his arms could keep her from leaving. The next morning, Aurora was taken into surgery. As they wheeled her down the corridor, she caught sight of Zane through the glass, lying on his bed. The boy lifted a weak hand to wave. His lips moved, saying something she couldn't hear, but she read it clearly. "I love you." Aurora smiled and mouthed the words back. "I love you too." Then the operating room doors closed. Kian sat in the chair outside the hallway, hands clasped in front of him, head bowed. And for the first time in 20 years, since the day his father was shot dead in front of him, Kian Moretti prayed. He didn't know who he was praying to, God, fate, any power that might be listening, but he prayed that she would live, that both people he loved would survive this day. Zane was wheeled out to wait for his own neck surgery. The boy lay there holding his father's hand, his weak eyes fixed on the operating room door where Aurora was. "Dad," he whispered, "Miss Aurora is a superhero like you, right?" Kian looked at his son, then at the closed doors where the woman he loved was risking her life to save his child. "Yes," he whispered, his voice catching. "She's our superhero." The surgery lasted 4 hours. 4 hours that felt like 4 centuries to Kian. When the doctor finally stepped out with an exhausted, relieved smile and said Aurora was stable and the cardiac tissue had been successfully implanted into Zane, Kian nearly collapsed right there in the hallway. The 2 most important people in his life had both survived, but this wasn't the moment to rest. While Aurora lay in recovery, her skin pale as paper but her breathing steady, Kian began his war. He'd held back for too long. He'd allowed his enemies to live for too long. Now that they'd dared to touch his son, to touch the woman he loved, Kian Moretti was going to show the underworld what a boss's wrath looked like. The first order went out the moment he left the hospital to handle business. "Wipe out Frank Castellano's operation completely," he told his right hand. "Leave not a single man standing." Kian's men moved that very night. Castellano's hidden warehouses were raided. His most loyal soldiers vanished without a trace, and the trafficking network he'd built over 20 years collapsed within 48 hours. But Kian didn't stop there. He knew that killing Castellano would only make him a criminal in the eyes of the law, and he didn't want that to stain Zane and Aurora's lives. So he chose another way. A way even more ruthless. He sent every piece of evidence of Castellano's trafficking to the FBI, evidence he'd been collecting for years, waiting for the right moment. Lists of victims, transaction sites, secret bank accounts, the names of buyers inside and outside the United States, all of it. Frank Castellano was arrested on a Wednesday morning, right in front of the restaurant he used as a front. Security cameras captured him being handcuffed, his face going white as he realized the empire he'd built had fallen in a single night. He would never see freedom again. Next came Regina. She was arrested by the FBI as well, charged as an accomplice to trafficking, with every piece of proof that she'd sold Aurora to Tony Marchetti carefully preserved and delivered by Kian to the authorities. Aurora didn't have to testify in court. Kian made sure her identity was protected. But Regina would still serve at least 20 years. Brittany tried to run. She rented a car and drove south, planning to cross into Mexico and escape Kian's reach. But she didn't know Kian's bodyguards had tracked her every move since the day Aurora was kidnapped. She was stopped at a checkpoint near the shipping yards, with enough evidence of drugs and illegal cash in the vehicle, evidence someone had expertly planted. She wouldn't be leaving prison for a very long time. The news spread through the New York underworld like fire through dry grass. Frank Castellano was finished. The trafficking ring was crushed. Anyone who had threatened the Moretti family had been dealt with, and everyone knew who stood behind it. Kian Moretti. The boss had been silent for too long. The boss had restrained himself for the sake of his sick son, but the moment someone dared to touch what belonged to him, the world would burn. From that night on, no one in New York's criminal world dared speak the name Aurora Bennett or Zane Moretti with any malicious intent. Everyone understood one simple truth. Touch Kian Moretti's people, and you die. A week later, Aurora was awake and able to sit up. She was still weak, still needed rest, but every day she insisted on being wheeled to Zane's room. He was recovering better than expected. The tissue from Aurora had helped stabilize his small heart enough for him to wait for a full transplant. That afternoon, Aurora was sitting by Zane's bed, one hand holding his, the other smoothing his glossy black hair. When the hospital room door swung open, Carmela Moretti walked in. Aurora went rigid, her fingers tightening around Zane's hand on instinct. The powerful matriarch looked nothing like she had before. Her eyes were no longer knives. There was something tired there, something close to broken. She hadn't taken another step when Kian appeared and blocked her from the room. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice cold as ice. Carmela looked at her son, then passed his shoulder into the room where Zane lay with Aurora beside him. "I want to see my grandson," she said, and her voice no longer carried arrogance. It trembled. "You don't have that right," Kian said, not moving an inch. "You lost it the day you destroyed his chance to live. Kian, I'm his grandmother. You're the woman who almost killed him." Kian cut in, each word like a bullet. "You put the family name above your grandson's life. You don't deserve to be called his grandmother." Carmela stood there, silent. Then she looked through the glass into the room. Zane's small face was turned in sleep, and Aurora sat beside him, still holding his hand as if she would never let go. The waitress Carmela had despised, tried to drive away, tried to erase, had risked her own life to save Carmela's grandson. And Carmela, Zane's blood grandmother, what had she done? She had nearly killed him. Aurora lifted her head and met Carmela's eyes through the glass. She said nothing, because she didn't have to. Her gaze held no hatred, no contempt, only the simple truth that she would protect Zane at any cost. And no one, not even his grandmother, could change that. For the first time in her life, Carmela Moretti felt what it was to lose. Not a deal, not a power struggle, but the war for her own family's love. She turned away without another word and walked out of the hospital, her shoulders bowed. Aurora watched her disappear through the doors, then looked at Kian standing there with his face still cold, but exhaustion in his eyes. She didn't ask if he was all right. She simply held out her hand, and he came to her, sat down beside her, and took it. The three of them sat in silence, and even though the world outside was shaking from the war Kian had unleashed, inside this small hospital room, they had everything they needed, each other. 2 weeks after the surgery, Aurora had recovered enough to be discharged, and Zane was growing stronger day by day thanks to the new cardiac tissue. The doctor said the boy could hold on for at least a few more months while they waited for a donor heart, and it was the best news they'd had in a long stretch of darkness. But fate didn't seem willing to leave them in peace. On a Monday morning, while Aurora sat reading to Zane in his hospital room, a woman walked in without warning. She looked about 35, with glossy blonde hair styled in careful curls, makeup flawless without a single smudge, and an expensive dress hugging her body as if she'd stepped straight off a magazine cover. But Aurora recognized her instantly from one detail alone: her eyes, the same gray as Zane's. Vanessa Moretti, Kian's ex-wife, the mother who had abandoned her son when he was only 3 and had just been diagnosed with a heart condition. "Zane," Vanessa cried, her voice so sweet it sounded false. "My baby. I've missed you so much." She rushed toward the bed, reaching to hug Zane, but the boy shrank back and pressed himself against Aurora as if searching for shelter. "Who is that?" Zane asked, his voice trembling, eyes fixed on the strange woman with confusion and fear. "You don't recognize your mother?" Vanessa stopped, the smile on her lips tightening. "It's Vanessa. I'm your real mother." Zane shook his head and clutched Aurora's hand even harder. "I don't know you. Miss Aurora takes care of me. Go away." Vanessa's expression flickered, but she smoothed it into a strained smile. Then she turned on Aurora with open hostility, sweeping her head to toe the way a woman sizes up a rival. "Who are you?" Vanessa demanded, her voice no longer sweet. "I'm Zane's caregiver," Aurora replied, her tone steady, but she had stood up now, instinct placing her between Vanessa and the child. "And you'd better leave before Kian finds out you're here." Vanessa gave a sharp little laugh. "Kian? He can't stop me from seeing my son. I'm Zane's mother. I have rights." At that moment, the hospital room door opened again. Kian stepped in, and the air instantly thickened. Like the seconds before a storm breaks, his gray eyes passed over Vanessa with a coldness even deeper than the way he looked at enemies. "Get out," he said, only 2 words, but heavy enough to make anyone shudder. Vanessa didn't back down. She lifted her chin and faced her ex-husband with defiance. "Kian, I want to talk. I've changed. I want to be a better mother for Zane. You want money," Kian cut in, his voice ice. "Your lover, that oil tycoon, went bankrupt last month. You're back not because of Zane, but because you don't have anyone left to cling to." Vanessa's face went pale, but she forced herself to recover. "That's not true. I love Zane. I'm his mother. You left him when he was 3, when he needed you most." Kian stepped closer, each footfall like a war drum. "You ran to Monaco with your lover while your son was in a hospital bed, not knowing if he'd live to see tomorrow. You didn't send a letter, not a phone call, for 4 years, and now you show up demanding mother's rights." Vanessa bit her lip, then changed tactics. She cried, tears sliding down her cheeks. But Aurora could see at once they were practiced tears, the tears of someone used to manipulating other people's feelings. "I was wrong," Vanessa sobbed. "I know I was wrong, but people can change. Please, give me a chance. I'll fight for visitation if I have to. The court will side with me, you know it. No judge takes away a mother's rights." Kian stared at her for a long moment, then took out his phone, opened a file, and held it up for her to read. "What is that?" Vanessa asked, her expression changing as her eyes moved across the screen. "Proof you contacted Frank Castellano 6 months ago," Kian said, his voice flat. "You sold him information about Zane's schedule in exchange for cash. You were part of the plan to kidnap your own son to extort me." Vanessa went white as paper. That's a lie. You made it up." "The court will decide," Kian said coldly. "I filed against you last week. The hearing is in 2 days, and with this evidence, you won't just lose visitation. You could go to prison for aiding and abetting kidnapping." 2 days later, the hearing moved faster than Aurora expected. The judge reviewed the evidence Kian's attorney presented, emails, recorded calls, money transfers, and made a ruling in less than an hour. Vanessa was stripped of all parental rights and ordered to stay at least 500 meters away from Zane. She also faced a separate criminal case for conspiring with Castellano. As she left the courthouse, Vanessa turned back, her face twisted with rage and hatred. "You'll regret this, Kian Moretti," she screamed, her shrill voice echoing down the corridor. "That boy doesn't need a mother anymore. He's got your new replacement now." Kian didn't respond. He simply turned away, his hand closing around Aurora's, and walked out of the courthouse without looking back. That night, Aurora sat by Zane's bed in the hospital. Someone had explained what happened in simple terms, not everything, only enough for him to understand that the woman wouldn't be coming back. "Miss Aurora," Zane said softly, "are you sad because that woman said bad things about you?" Aurora shook her head and smiled. "No, sweetheart, I'm not sad." Zane was quiet for a moment, then lifted his clear eyes to hers. "I don't need my old mom," he said seriously. "I have you. You take care of me. You sing to me. You bake for me. You're my mom." Aurora felt tears rise. She wrapped him in her arms. "I'll always be here with you," she whispered. "I promise." Zane lifted his head, his eyes bright again. "Then really be my mom. Marry my dad. Then we're a real family for real." Aurora laughed through tears, and when she looked up, she saw Kian standing in the doorway, one shoulder against the frame, gray eyes watching her with a warmth she'd never seen in him before. He gave a small nod, like a promise, like an answer to a question she hadn't dared to speak out loud. A week after the hearing with Vanessa, the call the family had been waiting for through months of fear finally came. The chief physician called Kian at 3 o'clock in the morning, his voice bright with excitement despite the hour. "We've found a heart," he said. "Texas. A 16-year-old died in a car accident. The family agreed to donate. The heart is completely healthy and a perfect match for Zane. We need to operate immediately." Aurora was asleep beside Zane's bed when Kian shook her awake. She saw his eyes in the dark, and she knew at once something important had happened. When he told her, she broke down right there, not from grief, but because hope had taken so long to find its way back to them. Zane was prepared for surgery that very night. He was still groggy when the nurses came to change him and check his numbers, but when he understood what was happening, his eyes lit up even through the exhaustion. "My new heart is really here?" he asked, his voice trembling with emotion. "It is, sweetheart," Aurora said, taking his hand and fighting to keep her tears under control. "Your new heart is here." Zane looked at his father, then at Aurora, then back at his father. "Dad, after I get my new heart, can I run like the other kids?" Kian knelt beside the bed, his hands trembling as he took Zane's small hand in his. "You'll run, you'll jump, you'll do anything you want," he said, his voice catching. "I promise." The boy smiled, then turned to Aurora. "Miss Aurora, after I'm better, you'll marry my dad, right? Then we'll be a real family for real." Aurora couldn't answer. She only bent down to kiss his forehead and whispered, "I love you, Zane. I love you so much." Then they wheeled him into the operating room. The doors closed, and Aurora and Kian began the longest wait of their lives. The first hour passed in silence. Aurora sat gripping Kian's hand so tightly, her fingers ached, eyes fixed on the operating room doors, as if she could will herself to see through them and find her son. Kian sat beside her, his face stone, but his hand was shaking too. The second hour, the third, the fourth crawled past. No one spoke. Nurses came and went, but no one stopped to give an update. Aurora felt each minute stretch into an hour, each hour into a day. By the 5th hour, she began to pray. She wasn't religious. She'd never believed in God or any higher power, but in that moment she was willing to beg anyone who might be listening. "Let him live. Please let my son live." In the 6th hour, the operating room doors opened. The chief physician stepped out, and Aurora knew at once something was wrong from his face. This wasn't the face of a man carrying good news. "There's a problem," he said, his voice heavy. "The new heart is showing signs of incompatibility. His body is rejecting it. We're trying to control it, but it's very serious." Aurora's knees gave out. She crumpled, and if Kian hadn't caught her, she would have hit her head on the floor. "No," she moaned, tears pouring like water. "No, please, don't." Kian held her, but he was trembling too. She could feel his body swaying, as if he were using every last ounce of strength to keep himself from collapsing. "Do everything you can," he told the doctor, his voice breaking. "Anything, whatever it costs. I'll pay for everything." The doctor nodded and went back inside, and they waited again. The 7th hour was the darkest. Nurses ran in and out nonstop. Alarms and machines screamed from behind the doors, and Aurora could hear doctors shouting urgent commands she didn't understand. Then came one long, unbroken beep, the flatline, the sound of a heart stopping. Aurora screamed, a sound that tore her throat apart and ripped through the silence of the hospital corridor. She lunged for the operating room doors, but the bodyguards blocked her. She punched, she kicked, she sobbed and howled like a wounded animal, but she couldn't get inside. Kian stood frozen. He didn't cry, he didn't shout, he didn't move. He simply stared at the closed doors as if his soul had left his body. 45 seconds. 45 seconds that felt like 45 years. 45 seconds where Zane's heart did not beat, and their world collapsed. Then the steady beeping returned. Beep, beep, beep. Aurora stopped screaming. She lifted her head, hardly daring to trust her own ears. That sound, that rhythm, was a heartbeat. Zane's heart was beating again. In the 8th hour, the operating room doors opened for the last time. The chief physician stepped out drenched in sweat, eyes red with exhaustion, but there was a smile on his face. "The new heart is beating," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "His body has accepted it. He's going to live." Aurora couldn't remember how she screamed, how she threw her arms around the doctor, How many times she thanked him. She only remembered turning to find Kian and seeing him standing there in the corridor. And for the first time since she'd known him, she saw tears on his face. Kian Moretti, the coldest mafia boss in New York, was crying, not quietly. He was sobbing, his shoulders shaking, tears streaming down the face that was usually ice. Aurora ran to him and held him tight, and they stood there in the hospital hallway, clinging to each other and crying like children. "Thank you," Kian whispered into her hair, his voice thick. "Thank you. Thank you." Aurora didn't know who he was thanking. The doctor, fate, God, or her. She didn't care. Her son was going to live. That was all she needed to know. 6 months passed like a dream. Zane recovered faster than anyone had dared to hope, his new heart beating strong in his small chest, and for the first time in his life he could run and play like other children. Aurora stood by the mansion window, watching Zane chase the golden retriever Kian had just bought him across the lawn, the boy's clear laughter echoing through the wide garden. She couldn't believe this was the same pale, fragile child who had been fading on a hospital bed only 6 months ago. Now Zane's cheeks were rosy, his eyes bright again, and he no longer had to swallow dozens of pills every day. Life in the Moretti estate had changed completely. Aurora was no longer Zane's caregiver. She'd become an irreplaceable part of the family, part of Kian and Zane's heart. Every morning she still woke early to make star-shaped pancakes with Zane. Every evening she still sang him to sleep, and every night she lay in Kian's arms, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat and feeling, deep in her bones, that she belonged here. That day was a Saturday evening when Kian suddenly told Aurora he wanted to take her out to dinner. She didn't suspect a thing. She put on a simple black dress Kian had given her for her birthday last month and got into the car with him. Zane didn't come along. The boy said he wanted to stay home and play with the dog, and Aurora thought nothing of it. The car didn't stop at any restaurant. Instead, it took them to a skyscraper in the heart of Manhattan, the tallest building in the city. Kian led her into a private elevator, and they went straight up to the rooftop. When the doors opened, Aurora caught her breath. The rooftop had been transformed with thousands of small candles, their flickering light blending with the glittering skyline of New York below, turning everything into something that felt like a fairy tale. Red roses were scattered across the floor. Soft music drifted from somewhere she couldn't see, and at the center of the rooftop, a small table had been set with quiet elegance, 2 glasses of wine waiting. "Kian." Aurora turned to him, eyes wide with disbelief. "What are you doing?" Kian didn't answer at once. He took her hand and led her through the candles to the middle of the rooftop, where the entire Manhattan skyline shimmered beneath them. "There's something I want to tell you," he began, his voice lower, warmer than usual. "But first, someone wants to see you." At that moment, the elevator doors opened again, and Zane ran out with a grin so big it practically split his face, a tiny red velvet box clutched in his hand. "Dad, I brought it," the boy shouted, racing to Kian and handing him the box. "I didn't drop it. I held it super careful." Aurora looked from Zane to Kian, her heart racing. She began to understand what was happening, but she didn't dare believe it. Kian took the box from his son, then slowly went down on one knee in front of Aurora. Zane, not to be outdone, dropped to one knee beside his father and copied him perfectly, making Aurora want to laugh and cry at the same time. "Aurora Bennett," Kian began, his voice trembling slightly, the gray eyes that were usually so cold now shining with something Aurora had never seen there before. "From the day you stepped into my life, from the day you sat in that dark storage room and agreed to marry my son so you could escape a witch, you changed everything. You saved Zane, not once, but again and again. You risked your life for him. You loved him like your own child even though you didn't have to." He paused, drew a slow breath, then continued. "And you saved me. You broke down the walls I built for 7 years. You taught me that love isn't weakness, it's strength. You gave me a reason to live beyond simply protecting my son." He opened the velvet box, and Aurora saw a diamond ring inside. Not too large, not flashy, just refined, perfect, exactly right. "Aurora, I want you to be my wife. I want you to be Zane's mother. I want you to be our family, officially and forever." Zane cut in, his excitement spilling over. "And I promise I'll share my toys with the baby, if you and Dad have a baby. I'll be the best big brother in the whole world." Aurora laughed through her tears, laughter tangled with sobs, and she didn't even know if she was crying from joy or from being overwhelmed. She looked at Kian, looked at Zane, looked at the two men who had become her whole world, kneeling in front of her under Manhattan's star-filled sky. "I've belonged to you for a long time," she said, her voice thick. "Since the first moment your son proposed to me in that awful little storage room, since the moment this 6-year-old promised to protect me from witches, I've been yours." She sank to her knees and took both their hands, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Yes, 1,000,000 times yes." Zane let out a scream of pure joy, jumped up, and threw his arms around Aurora. "Miss Aurora is really going to be my mom. I'm really going to have a mom." Kian rose and pulled both Aurora and Zane into his arms, holding them so tightly it was as if he feared they'd disappear the second he let go. "I love you," he whispered into Aurora's hair. "I love you more than you can imagine." Aurora lifted her face, looked into the gray eyes of the man she loved, and smiled. "I love you too, and I love our son." They stood there, the three of them, in the candlelit glow on the rooftop, Manhattan glittering beneath them, and Aurora knew that at last, after 27 years of being lost, she had found home. The wedding took place on a spring day drenched in golden sunlight, in the wide garden of the Moretti estate, dressed in thousands of white flowers and soft ribbons that fluttered in the breeze. Aurora stood before the mirror, staring at her reflection, unable to believe it was her. The waitress who once hid in a restaurant storage room to escape the people hunting her, now wearing a pure white wedding gown with glimmering emerald accents, the color of her eyes, the color Kian said he loved most. Zane burst into the room in a tiny black suit that matched his father's perfectly, a basket of rose petals in his hands. "Mom, you're so beautiful," he shouted, his eyes shining. "I'm gonna throw so many petals for you to walk through." Aurora knelt and pulled her son into her arms, happiness rising in her throat until it almost hurt. He'd been calling her mom since the day she said yes, and every time she heard that word, her heart melted all over again. "That's my good boy," she whispered. "I love you." The ceremony began beneath an arch of white blossoms in the middle of the garden. Kian stood there waiting for her, dressed in black, hair smoothed into place, but his gray eyes, usually so cold, now glowed with a light Aurora knew belonged only to her and to Zane. Zane walked ahead, scattering petals across the aisle, so enthusiastic that the petals flew up onto the guests' heads, but no one complained. Everyone laughed and clapped. When Aurora reached Kian, he took her hand, and she could feel his fingers trembling. The most powerful mafia boss in New York was shaking with happiness. Their vows were spoken in the spring wind and birdsong. Kian looked into Aurora's eyes and said, his voice deep, warm, thick with feeling, "I swear I'll protect you from every shadow. I swear I'll love you more each day than I did the day before. I swear I'll do whatever it takes to keep you and our son happy." Aurora squeezed his hand, her voice unsteady but strong. "I swear I'll be the light that leads you home whenever you lose your way. I swear I'll love our son as if I gave birth to him myself. I swear I'll stand beside you through storms and sunshine." Right then, Zane wedged himself between them, tipping his face up with an earnestness so sweet it made everyone's chest ache. "I have vows too," he announced. "I swear I'll eat all my vegetables." The entire wedding burst into laughter, and Aurora pulled him into her arms, while Kian wrapped an arm around both of them. They kissed beneath the white flower arch, and the applause rolled like thunder. 1 year later, Aurora sat in an armchair by the window, cradling a newborn baby girl with silky black hair and green eyes just like her mother's. Hope Moretti, the little daughter she and Kian had waited 9 months for. Zane stood beside her, rising onto his toes to look at his sister, his eyes bright. "She's so pretty, Mom," he whispered, afraid to wake her. "I'm gonna protect her like Dad protects you." Kian stepped into the room and paused in the doorway, looking at his wife and children with an expression Aurora could describe with only one word: content. He walked to her, kissed Aurora's forehead, then kissed Hope's forehead, then ruffled Zane's hair. "Dad." Zane looked up at him with a grin. "Was I right? I picked you a really good wife, didn't I?" Kian laughed and lifted his son into his arms. "You did. You picked the best wife in the world." Aurora watched the two of them, then looked down at the tiny baby in her arms, and she felt tears threaten again. She'd come so far, from an orphaned girl abused by her own family, sold like an object, running in fear and despair, to this woman, a wife, a mother, someone loved without condition. She turned to kiss Zane's cheek and whispered, "Thank you for finding me in that awful storage room. Thank you for proposing to me." Zane beamed and looped his arms around her neck. I love you the most in the world, after Dad, and baby Hope, and the dog, but you're still the most." Aurora laughed, and Kian pulled their little family close, the four of them standing there by the window, looking out over a garden flooded with spring sunshine, and she knew this was the happiness she'd been searching for her entire life. It all began with 4 innocent words in a dark storage room. "Marry me." She'd thought it was only a child's game. It turned out to be the beginning of a lifetime of happiness. This story brings us many precious lessons about life. It is the power of unconditional love, the ability to heal the deepest wounds, the faith that no matter how heavy the darkness becomes, the light will still find those who refuse to stop hoping. Aurora taught us that a person's worth doesn't lie in their origins or circumstances, but in their heart and the courage to love. And Kian showed us that even the coldest hearts can melt when they finally meet the right person. And Zane, a little boy with a sick heart but a love so vast, reminded us that sometimes miracles begin with the simplest things: a child's innocent proposal, a pinky promise, a love without conditions. Dear friends, if this story touched your heart, please tap the like button and share it to spread a message of love to more people. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss moving stories every day. We'd truly love to hear your thoughts. What did this story make you think about? Have you ever faced anything similar in real life? Leave a comment below to share what's in your heart. Every comment you leave is a precious source of encouragement that helps us keep creating more meaningful content. Wishing everyone watching this video strong health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace and happiness. Thank you for being here with us. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.